It was a cold and somber morning, the kind that made every breath hang in the air like a ghost. There's something inherently sinister about silence, especially when it clings to an old, sprawling manor tucked deep in the English countryside. As I, Jonathan Harrow, a private investigator turned reluctant sleuth, stepped into the shadowed halls of Blackthorn Manor, I had no idea that this case would haunt me in ways I never thought possible. It all began with an unassuming letter, one that whispered of deceit, betrayal, and a secret that had remained buried for decades. That same morning, the rain pattered softly against my office window, and the faint smell of damp paper filled the air as I broke the wax seal. The envelope felt heavier than usual, its contents deliberate, as though every word had been etched with care. The script on the thick parchment was an elegant cursive, betraying its age. It read, "Dear Mr. Harrow, I write to you with great urgency. Our family estate, Blackthorn Manor, has become the center of a dire dispute that only your expertise can resolve. The matter concerns an inheritance that has divided our family beyond repair, and tensions within these walls grow more unbearable by the day. Please come at once. Your discretion will be rewarded generously. Yours sincerely, E. Blackthorn." At first glance, it seemed like just another family squabble, albeit dressed up in finer language. My line of work had brought me into contact with such dramas often. Bitter siblings clawing for scraps of wealth, estranged heirs materializing at the reading of wills. But something about this letter gnawed at me. The tone wasn't simply formal. It carried an undertone of desperation, as though the writer feared that each moment wasted brought them closer to some calamity. I hesitated. The rain outside thickened, streaking the glass and blurring the city skyline. Cases like this often meant venturing into the depths of personal vendettas, half-truths, and long-buried resentments. And yet something about Blackthorn Manor intrigued me. Perhaps it was the allure of stepping away from the mundane and into the gothic grandeur of the unknown. Or perhaps it was the small voice in my mind whispering, "This is different." My arrival at Blackthorn Manor was nothing short of dramatic. The journey through the countryside had been shrouded in fog, the roads winding and narrow, as though leading me into a world detached from reality. When the manor finally came into view, I was struck by its sheer scale and eerie beauty. Ivy climbed its stone walls like nature's attempt to reclaim what man had built. Tall windows stared out like vacant eyes, their panes glinting faintly in the pale sunlight that filtered through the clouds. A wrought iron gate creaked open slowly as I approached, its hinges protesting against the intrusion. The pathway to the front door was lined with statues, their weathered faces frozen in expressions of melancholy or defiance. I half expected the statues to move under my gaze, so lifelike were their details. By the time I reached the grand oak doors, my sense of unease had settled into a familiar hum, the kind that precedes every great mystery. The doors themselves seemed almost sentient, heavy with age and history, as if they had witnessed centuries of secrets and scandals. As I reached for the ornate brass knocker, I noticed a faint engraving on the wood, a crest, perhaps a family sigil, that depicted a raven clutching a key. The imagery sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't yet place why. I struck the knocker once, the sound resonating deeply into the stillness. Inside, the air was cold and heavy with the scent of aged wood and faintly burned candles. A chandelier loomed above, its crystals refracting light in fractured rainbows that did little to warm the space. It was as though the house itself held its breath, waiting. My first step onto the creaking floorboards echoed ominously, and I wondered how long it had been since this house had seen joy. As I stood in the cavernous entryway, I heard the faint shuffle of footsteps approaching. A tall, thin woman emerged from a side corridor. Her hair, streaked with silver, was tied back severely, and her sharp eyes appraised me with the precision of a predator. She extended a hand, gloved in black lace. "Mr. Harrow, "I presume," she said, her voice clipped and formal. "I am Lady Eleanor Blackthorn. Welcome to my home." I nodded, taking her hand briefly, the fabric cool against my palm. "Thank you for inviting me, Lady Blackthorn. Your letter was intriguing." Her lips curved slightly, though it was not a smile of warmth. Intriguing is an understatement. You'll find that Blackthorn Manor has a way of drawing people in, for better or worse. Her words lingered in the air as she led me deeper into the house, the shadows lengthening with each step. Already, I could feel the weight of the secrets that Blackthorn Manor carried. Little did I know, they were darker than I could have ever imagined. As Lady Eleanor guided me through the manor's labyrinthine halls, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. The portraits lining the walls seemed to watch my every move, their subjects painted with an uncanny realism. Generations of Blackthorns stared back at me, stern patriarchs, elegant women in Victorian dress, and children with solemn expressions far beyond their years. It was as if they were silently judging my intrusion. "This manor has been in the Blackthorn family for centuries," Lady Eleanor explained, her voice echoing faintly in the dimly lit corridor. "Each brick, each beam, carries our legacy. But legacies, Mr. Harrow, are not without their shadows." Her words hung in the air as we entered a spacious drawing room. The faint scent of lavender and old leather mingled with the warmth of a roaring fire. Seated around the room were the other inhabitants of Blackthorn Manor, each one a character pulled straight from a Gothic novel. "Allow me to introduce you," Lady Eleanor said, her tone carrying a hint of command. "This is my nephew, Charles." A man in his early 30s rose from an armchair. His sharp features were framed by dark, slightly disheveled hair, and his smile was charming, if a bit forced. "Pleasure," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, but his eyes betrayed a certain restlessness, as if he were constantly calculating. "Beatrice, our housekeeper," Lady Eleanor continued, gesturing to a woman standing near the fireplace. Beatrice was a slight, mousy figure with downcast eyes and a nervous energy that made her seem perpetually on edge. She nodded quickly, avoiding my gaze. "And finally, Professor Aldrich, a dear family friend and occasional houseguest." The professor was an older man with a neatly trimmed beard and a scholarly air. His glasses perched precariously on his nose as he studied me with keen interest. "Mr. Harrow," he said with a slight bow of his head, "I've heard much about your investigative prowess." I offered a polite smile, taking in the group before me. It was clear that each of them carried their own secrets, their own motives for being here. The atmosphere in the room was tense, as if an invisible thread connected them all, pulling tighter with each passing moment. Before I could respond, Lady Eleanor clapped her hands lightly, breaking the silence. "Now that introductions are out of the way, let us retire to the dining room. Supper is served." The dining room was as grand and foreboding as the rest of the manor. A long mahogany table dominated the space, its surface gleaming under the light of a crystal chandelier. The meal was elaborate, but the conversation was sparse, each person seemingly lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until dessert was served that Lady Eleanor finally spoke. "I trust you've noticed the tension in this house, Mr. Harrow," she said, her gaze piercing. "There is much more at stake here than a simple inheritance dispute. The Blackthorn name is at risk, and I will do whatever it takes to protect it." Her words were met with a murmur of agreement from Charles, while Beatrice's grip on her wine glass tightened visibly. Professor Aldrich, however, merely observed, his expression unreadable. As the evening wore on, I found myself drawn deeper into the enigma of Blackthorn Manor. The shadows seemed to grow longer, the whispers of the past louder. One thing was certain: this was no ordinary case, and the secrets of the Blackthorn family were only beginning to reveal themselves. As Lady Eleanor guided me through the manor's labyrinthine halls, I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. The portraits lining the walls seemed to watch my every move, their subjects painted with an uncanny realism. Generations of Blackthorns stared back at me. Stern patriarchs, elegant women in Victorian dress, and children with solemn expressions far beyond their years. It was as if they were silently judging my intrusion. "This manor has been in the Blackthorn family for centuries," Lady Eleanor explained, her voice echoing faintly in the dimly lit corridor. "Each brick, each beam, carries our legacy. But legacies, Mr. Harrow, are not without their shadows." Her words hung in the air as we entered a spacious drawing room. The faint scent of lavender and old leather mingled with the warmth of a roaring fire. Seated around the room were the other inhabitants of Blackthorn Manor, each one a character pulled straight from a Gothic novel. "Allow me to introduce you," Lady Eleanor said, her tone carrying a hint of command. "This is my nephew, Charles." A man in his early 30s rose from an armchair. His sharp features were framed by dark, slightly disheveled hair, and his smile was charming, if a bit forced. "Pleasure," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, but his eyes betrayed a certain restlessness, as if he were constantly calculating. "Beatrice, our housekeeper," Lady Eleanor continued, gesturing to a woman standing near the fireplace. Beatrice was a slight, mousy figure with downcast eyes and a nervous energy that made her seem perpetually on edge. She nodded quickly, avoiding my gaze. "And finally, Professor Aldrich, a dear family friend and occasional house-guest." The professor was an older man with a neatly trimmed beard and a scholarly air. His glasses perched precariously on his nose as he studied me with keen interest. "Mr. Harrow," he said with a slight bow of his head, "I've heard much about your investigative prowess." I offered a polite smile, taking in the group before me. It was clear that each of them carried their own secrets, their own motives for being here. The atmosphere in the room was tense, as if an invisible thread connected them all, pulling tighter with each passing moment. Before I could respond, Lady Eleanor clapped her hands lightly, breaking the silence. "Now that introductions are out of the way, let us retire to the dining room. Supper is served." The dining room was as grand and foreboding as the rest of the manor. A long mahogany table dominated the space, its surface gleaming under the light of a crystal chandelier. The meal was elaborate, but the conversation was sparse, each person seemingly lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until dessert was served that Lady Eleanor finally spoke. "I trust you've noticed the tension in this house, Mr. Harrow," she said, her gaze piercing. "There is much more at stake here than a simple inheritance dispute. The Blackthorn name is at risk, and I will do whatever it takes to protect it." Her words were met with a murmur of agreement from Charles, while Beatrice's grip on her wine glass tightened visibly. Professor Aldrich, however, merely observed, his expression unreadable. As the evening wore on, I found myself drawn deeper into the enigma of Blackthorn Manor. The shadows seemed to grow longer, the whispers of the past louder. One thing was certain. This was no ordinary case, and the secrets of the Blackthorn family were only beginning to reveal themselves. After dinner, Lady Eleanor excused herself, leaving me alone with the remaining trio. Charles leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of brandy with a practiced nonchalance. "So, Mr. Harrow," he began, his tone laced with curiosity, "what's your take on all this? Do you think you'll solve the great Blackthorn mystery?" "It's too soon to tell," I replied cautiously, "but I intend to uncover the truth, whatever it may be." He chuckled softly. "Careful what you wish for. This place has a way of keeping its secrets." Beatrice, who had been quietly clearing the table, paused at his words. Her hands trembled slightly, causing the silverware to clink against the tray. "Is something the matter, Beatrice?" I asked, my voice gentle but probing. She hesitated, her eyes darting toward Charles before quickly looking away. "No, sir," she murmured. "Just a bit tired is all." Professor Aldrich chose that moment to interject. You'll find, Mr. Harrow, that the past has a strong grip on this house. It seeps into the very walls, the very air. Perhaps that's why it's so hard to let go." His cryptic remark hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the silence with its soft, steady rhythm. I made a mental note to speak with each of them individually in the coming days. If I was to untangle this web, I needed to understand the players involved. When I finally retired to my room, the sense of unease followed me. The narrow corridor leading to my quarters was lined with more portraits, their painted eyes gleaming in the faint light of the wall sconces. It felt as though they were watching, waiting. Inside, the room was as ornate as the rest of the manor. Heavy drapes framed the windows, and the four-poster bed looked inviting, but somehow ominous. As I prepared for bed, a faint tapping sound caught my attention. It was soft, rhythmic, and coming from somewhere beyond the walls. I pressed my ear to the plaster, straining to pinpoint the source. The sound was faint but persistent, like a clock ticking in an empty room. Making a note to investigate further in the morning, I climbed out of bed, the sound following me into a restless sleep. The morning light streamed weakly through the thick curtains of my room, casting muted shadows across the ornate furnishings. I had slept fitfully, haunted by vague dreams of whispers and shadowy figures lurking just out of reach. As I dressed, the persistent tapping sound from the previous night lingered in my thoughts. It had seemed to come from within the walls themselves, a rhythmic pattern that felt almost deliberate. Beatrice's soft knock at my door startled me from my musings. I opened it to find her standing there, clutching a silver tray with a steaming cup of tea. "Good morning, Mr. Harrow," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lady Eleanor has requested your presence in the library after breakfast." "Thank you, Beatrice," I replied, taking the tea. Her gaze darted to the floor, and she hesitated as if wanting to say more, but then she hurried away before I could press her. The library was as imposing as I had imagined. Towering shelves crammed with ancient tomes stretched to the high ceilings, their spines bearing titles in languages I couldn't begin to decipher. The room smelled of leather and aged paper, a scent both comforting and oppressive. Lady Eleanor stood by a large oak desk, rifling through a pile of documents with an air of agitation. "Ah, Mr. Harrow," she said without looking up. "I trust you've had a restful night." "Restful might be an exaggeration," I said, stepping closer. "There's something about this house that seems determined to keep me awake." Her lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "You're not the first to say that." She gestured to a chair opposite the desk. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." As I took my seat, she handed me a worn ledger. The cover was cracked with age, and the pages were filled with meticulous handwriting. "This belonged to my late husband," she explained. "He kept detailed records of the family's affairs, including some matters that were less than legal." I flipped through the pages, noting references to land disputes, questionable business dealings, and payments to individuals whose names were conspicuously absent. "This is quite the collection of secrets," I said, looking up at her. "But why show it to me now?" Lady Eleanor's expression hardened. "Because someone in this house is using these secrets against us. Letters have been sent, threats made. If these records were to fall into the wrong hands, it would ruin the Blackthorn name forever. Do you have any idea who might be responsible?" I asked. "If I did, you wouldn't be here," she said sharply. Then, softening, she added, "But I have my suspicions. Charles has always been reckless with money, and Beatrice, well, she knows more than she lets on. As for Professor Aldridge, he's a brilliant man, but his loyalty is to knowledge, not to us." Her words painted a picture of a household teetering on the edge of collapse, each member a potential threat. I made a mental note to speak with each of them individually, starting with Charles. I found Charles in the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with exotic plants and the faint hum of bees. He was seated on a wicker chair, a cigarette dangling from his fingers as he stared out at the mist-covered gardens. "You're up early," I said, taking a seat across from him. "Habit," he replied, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Or maybe it's this damned house. Makes it hard to sleep, doesn't it?" I studied him for a moment, noting the tension in his jaw and the way his fingers tapped restlessly against the arm of the chair. "Your aunt seems to think you might have a motive for stirring up trouble," I said bluntly. He barked a laugh, shaking his head. "Of course she does. Eleanor's always thought the worst of me. But let me ask you something, Mr. Harrow. Why would I jeopardize my own inheritance?" "Desperation can make people do strange things," I countered. "And from what I hear, your finances aren't exactly in order." His smile faded, replaced by a flicker of anger. "I may have debts, but I'm not stupid. If this family goes down, so do I." His response was convincing, but there was a bitterness in his tone that hinted at deeper grievances. As I left the conservatory, I couldn't help but wonder if his resentment might yet drive him to sabotage. Next, I sought out Beatrice. I found her in the kitchen, kneading dough with a vigor that suggested she was trying to work out more than just bread. "Busy morning," I said, leaning against the doorframe. She jumped slightly, her hands stilling. "Oh, Mr. Harrow, you startled me." "My apologies," I said, stepping into the room. "I was hoping we could talk." Her eyes darted to the doorway, as if checking to make sure we were alone. "About what?" she asked cautiously. "About the letters Lady Eleanor mentioned. She seems to think someone in the house is behind them." Beatrice's hands trembled slightly as she resumed kneading. "I don't know anything about that," she said, her voice barely audible. "You must have noticed something," I pressed. "Strange behavior, conversations that didn't add up. Anything could help." She hesitated, her gaze fixed on the dough. "Sometimes at night, I hear footsteps in the halls. But when I look, there's no one there." "And the tapping?" I asked. "Have you heard that too?" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. "You've heard it," she whispered. When I nodded, she swallowed hard. "It's been happening for weeks now. I thought I was imagining it." Her fear seemed genuine, but fear could also be a convenient mask. As I left the kitchen, my list of suspects remained frustratingly unchanged. Each person had their secrets, their motives, but no clear answers. What I did know was that Blackthorn Manor itself seemed to be alive with secrets, and the more I uncovered, the more I felt the weight of its shadow pressing down on me. The air in Blackthorn Manor grew heavier as the day wore on, as though the house itself disapproved of my investigations. Shadows stretched long across the hallways, and the faint tapping I had heard the night before seemed to follow me wherever I went, though no source could be found. By mid-afternoon, I had resolved to take a closer look at the library. Lady Eleanor's warnings about the Blackthorn family's secrets still echoed in my mind. The library was as foreboding as ever, the smell of old books mingling with the faint scent of damp stone. I began combing through the shelves, looking for anything that might explain the cryptic ledger Lady Eleanor had shown me earlier. My fingers brushed against a weathered volume titled Histories of the Blackthorn Lineage. It was a large, leather-bound book with pages that crackled softly as I opened it. The entries were meticulous, detailing births, deaths, and marriages within the family. But what caught my attention was a section near the back of the book, where the tone of the writing shifted. It spoke of a series of disputes over land and wealth, but there was one passage that stood out. "The curse of the Blackthorn line shall endure as long as its secrets remain buried. Those who seek the truth must tread carefully, for the house itself guards its mysteries." A chill ran down my spine. The idea of a house guarding its secrets felt absurd, yet the unease that clung to every corner of Blackthorn Manor made the notion seem less far-fetched. As I closed the book, the sound of footsteps startled me. I turned to see Professor Aldridge standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "Finding anything interesting, Mr. Harrow?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge of curiosity. "Plenty," I replied, slipping the book back onto the shelf. "It seems the Blackthorn family has a rather colorful history." He stepped further into the room, his gaze lingering on the shelves. History is written by the victors, as they say. But here, in this house, it's the shadows that tell the real story. There was something about the way he said it that made me pause. "What do you mean?" I asked, watching him carefully. Aldridge smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. The Blackthorn family has always been protective of its legacy. But protection can sometimes take unusual forms. If you're not careful, Mr. Harrow, you may find yourself tangled in something far more dangerous than you anticipated. Before I could press him further, he turned and left, his footsteps fading into the distance. His cryptic words only deepened my suspicion that he knew more than he was letting on. Later that evening, Lady Eleanor summoned everyone to the dining room for a family meeting. The atmosphere was tense, each person's unease palpable as we took our seats around the long mahogany table. Charles drummed his fingers impatiently, while Beatrice avoided eye contact with everyone. Professor Aldridge sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the empty plate before him. Lady Eleanor's presence was commanding as she rose from her chair, her sharp eyes sweeping over the group. "It has come to my attention that there are forces at work seeking to undermine this family," she began. "I will not tolerate betrayal within these walls. If any of you have information about the letters or the threats, I suggest you speak now." The room fell into an uneasy silence. Charles shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Beatrice's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her napkin. Aldridge, as always, remained impassive, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something. Guilt, perhaps? "Very well," Lady Eleanor said after a long pause. "If no one will come forward, then I have no choice but to take drastic measures." Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and I could see the unease ripple through the group. Charles finally broke the silence, his voice filled with frustration. "This is absurd, Eleanor. You can't seriously believe one of us is behind this." "Can I?" she retorted sharply. "You've given me plenty of reason to doubt your loyalty, Charles." He rose from his chair, his fists clenched. "If you think I'd jeopardize my own inheritance, then you're more paranoid than I thought." "Sit down, Charles," Eleanor commanded, her voice cold and unwavering. Reluctantly, he obeyed, though his glare could have cut through stone. I observed the exchange with interest, noting how each person reacted. Beatrice appeared on the verge of tears, her shoulders hunched as though she wished to disappear. Aldridge's expression remained neutral, though his fingers tapped lightly against the table, a subtle sign of agitation. After the meeting dispersed, I decided to take a walk through the grounds to clear my head. The night was cool and damp, the mist curling around the ancient trees like ghostly tendrils. As I wandered, the faint tapping sound returned, this time louder and more deliberate. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the old chapel near the edge of the property. The chapel was a crumbling relic, its stone walls overgrown with ivy and its stained glass windows shattered long ago. As I approached, the tapping ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay. Broken pews lay scattered across the floor, and the altar was covered in a layer of dust so thick it obscured the intricate carvings beneath. But what caught my attention was a trapdoor partially concealed beneath a rotting carpet. I hesitated for a moment before lifting the trapdoor, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. The air that wafted up was cold and damp, carrying with it a faint metallic tang. With my lantern in hand, I descended slowly, each step echoing in the confined space. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, stone chamber. The walls were lined with shelves holding what appeared to be ancient documents and artifacts. In the center of the room was a table, and upon it lay a journal. The leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages within were filled with spidery handwriting. As I skimmed through the entries, my blood ran cold. The journal detailed rituals and sacrifices performed by the Blackthorn family in an effort to protect their wealth and power. The tapping sound I had heard was mentioned repeatedly, described as a sign of the house's restless spirits. A sudden noise behind me made me spin around, my heart hammering in my chest. A figure stood at the top of the staircase, their features obscured by shadow. "I warned you, Mr. Harrow," a familiar voice said, dripping with menace. "Some secrets are better left buried." The figure's voice echoed in the chamber, low and threatening, as though the stone walls themselves conspired to amplify its menace. My lantern's feeble glow barely penetrated the darkness, but it was enough to make out the shadowy silhouette at the top of the stairs. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice steadier than I felt. The journal in my hand seemed to pulse with the weight of its forbidden knowledge, the pages whispering unspoken truths into the silence. The figure stepped forward, revealing Professor Aldrich. His expression was inscrutable, his eyes glinting with a mixture of concern and something darker. "I told you to tread carefully, Mr. Harrow," he said, descending the stairs slowly. "There are forces at play here you don't understand." I held up the journal. "You mean this? These rituals, these sacrifices? Is this what the Blackthorn family has been hiding?" Aldrich sighed, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "It's more complicated than that. The Blackthorn curse isn't just superstition. It's real, and it's tied to this house, to this land. The family has been trying to contain it for generations." His words sent a chill through me. "Contain it? At what cost?" "Too high a cost," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "But the alternative is far worse. The tapping you've heard, the unease you've felt, it's the curse stirring. It grows restless, stronger. If we don't act soon, it will consume us all." Before I could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the staircase. Beatrice appeared, her face pale and her breath labored. "Professor," she gasped, "Lady Eleanor has collapsed." Without another word, we rushed back to the manor, the oppressive atmosphere of the underground chamber clinging to me like a second skin. When we reached the drawing room, we found Lady Eleanor slumped in a chair, her skin ashen and her breathing shallow. Charles stood nearby, pacing like a caged animal. "What happened?" I asked, kneeling beside her. "She was fine one moment, then she just collapsed," Charles said, his voice tinged with panic. "I don't know what's wrong with her." Professor Aldrich examined her quickly, his expression grim. "It's the curse," he said quietly. "It's taken hold of her." "What does that mean?" I demanded, rising to my feet. "How do we stop it?" Aldrich hesitated, then turned to Charles and Beatrice. "We need the ledger. The original one, not the copy Lady Eleanor showed, Mr. Harrow." "Where is it?" Charles exchanged a nervous glance with Beatrice. "It's in the vault," he admitted reluctantly. "Then we have no time to lose," Aldrich said, already heading for the door. "Bring it to the library. Now." The vault was hidden behind a false panel in the study, its heavy iron door requiring both a key and a combination to open. Charles and Beatrice worked together, their movements tense and hurried. When the door finally creaked open, the air inside was cold and stale, the faint metallic tang of age lingering in the shadows. The ledger was an imposing book, larger and more ornate than the one I had seen before. Its cover was embossed with a blackthorn crest, the raven and key glinting faintly in the dim light. Charles carried it carefully, as though it might shatter under his touch. Back in the library, Aldrich spread the ledger across the table, flipping through its pages with practiced ease. The entries were written in the same meticulous hand, but these were far more detailed, chronicling every ritual, every sacrifice made to appease the curse. "There," he said, pointing to a passage. "The ritual of binding. It's the only way to contain the curse." I leaned over his shoulder, reading the passage aloud. "To bind the curse, the blood of the family must be offered willingly, sealing the pact anew." I looked up, the implication sinking in. "It's a blood sacrifice?" Aldridge nodded grimly. That's why the Blackthorn family has always been so protective of its secrets. This ritual has been performed every generation, but it requires a direct descendant's willingness. Charles paled. You're not seriously suggesting. It has to be done, Aldridge said firmly. Lady Eleanor is too weak. That leaves you, Charles. Charles stepped back, shaking his head. No, absolutely not. There has to be another way. There isn't, Aldridge insisted. If the curse isn't contained, it will destroy not just this family, but anyone who sets foot on these grounds. The argument raged on, but I couldn't help feeling there was more to this story. The journal I had found in the chapel, the cryptic warnings from Aldridge, the tapping that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the house. It all pointed to something deeper, something more insidious than a mere curse. As the night wore on, I found myself wandering the halls of Blackthorn Manor, the ledger's words haunting me. What if this wasn't just about binding the curse? What if the rituals were feeding it, keeping it alive rather than containing it? The tapping returned, louder this time, as though urging me toward a hidden truth. I followed it, my footsteps echoing in the silent corridors, until I found myself back in the library. The ledger lay open on the table, its pages fluttering slightly in a draft I couldn't feel. And there, scrawled on the margins of one page, were words that hadn't been there before. The curse lives in the blood. To break it, the line must end. The meaning was clear, and it sent a cold shiver down my spine. The Blackthorn family wasn't just cursed, they were the curse. And the only way to end it would be to destroy them all. The revelation from the ledger haunted me as I paced the dimly lit corridors of Blackthorn Manor. The words scrawled in the margins, the curse lives in the blood. To break it, the line must end up played on a loop in my mind. Was this the ultimate truth hidden by generations of Blackthorns? That their very existence sustained the malevolent force tethered to this place? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running out of time. The oppressive atmosphere of the manor seemed to intensify, the air thick with something unseen but palpable. The faint tapping that had haunted me from the start now felt more insistent, almost urgent, as if the house itself was trying to guide me toward its secrets. Lady Eleanor's condition had worsened. She lay in her room, barely conscious, her breathing shallow. Charles hovered at her bedside, his usual bravado replaced by a rare display of vulnerability. "We can't keep pretending this is normal," I said, stepping into the room. "The ledger makes it clear. The curse demands a price." Charles looked up, his face pale. "And you think that price is us? Our bloodline?" "It's more than a theory," I replied. "Every ritual, every sacrifice, it's been feeding the curse, not binding it. And now it's out of control." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. "There has to be another way. We can't just end everything. Do you think I want this?" I shot back, my voice rising. "But look around you. This house is dying. Your aunt is dying. How many more lives have to be lost before you accept the truth?" Before he could respond, Beatrice appeared in the doorway, her expression tight with fear. "Mr. Harrow, Professor Aldridge wants to see you in the chapel. He says it's urgent." The chapel was shrouded in shadows, its crumbling walls seeming to close in around me as I descended the stairs to the underground chamber. Aldridge stood by the central table, the journal I'd discovered earlier open before him. His lantern cast flickering light across his face, making his features appear gaunt and spectral. "Have you pieced it together yet, Mr. Harrow?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with a strange intensity. "I've pieced together enough," I said, stepping closer. "The curse, the rituals, it's all been perpetuated by the family. And now, the ledger says the only way to end it is to destroy the line entirely." Aldridge nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "You're not wrong. But there's one thing you've missed." "What's that?" "The curse doesn't just live in the blood," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It chooses its vessel." A cold dread settled over me. "What are you saying?" He gestured to the journal, pointing to a passage I hadn't noticed before. The words were faded but legible. The chosen will bear the mark of the raven, their fate bound to the curse until it is broken. I stared at him, my mind racing. And who's the chosen? Aldridge met my gaze, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. It's Charles. The implications hit me like a blow. If Charles was the chosen, then the curse's hold on the Blackthorn family was tied directly to him. Destroying the bloodline might break the curse, but it would also mean sacrificing him. We have to tell him, I said, turning toward the stairs. But Aldridge's hand shot out, gripping my arm with surprising strength. Wait, he said urgently. You don't understand. If we tell him, it will only make things worse. The curse thrives on fear and despair. We have to act carefully. I pulled free from his grip. Carefully or not, he has a right to know. When I returned to the manor, I found Charles in the library, staring out the window at the mist-covered grounds. He turned as I entered, his expression wary. What now? He asked, his voice heavy. We need to talk, I said. It's about the curse. The conversation that followed was fraught with tension. As I laid out what Aldridge and I had discovered, Charles's initial disbelief gave way to anger, then despair. You're saying this is my fault? He demanded, his voice shaking. No, I said firmly. This isn't your fault, but you are the key to ending it. The question is whether you're willing to do what it takes. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. I don't know if I can, he whispered. What if I can't go through with it? Before I could answer, the tapping sound returned, louder than ever. It echoed through the library, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from the very walls. Charles looked up, his face pale. What the hell is that? He asked. I don't know, I admitted, but I think it's time we found out. Following the sound, we made our way through the manor, the tapping growing more insistent with each step. It led us to a hidden door I hadn't noticed before, tucked behind a tapestry in the great hall. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow passageway descending into darkness. Armed with lanterns, Charles and I ventured into the passage. The air grew colder with each step, the walls damp and slick. At the end of the corridor, we found a massive circular chamber. The floor was etched with intricate symbols, and at the center stood an ancient altar. On the altar lay a small, obsidian raven figurine, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on us like a weight. What is this place? Charles whispered. The heart of the curse, I replied, my voice barely audible. This is where it all began. As we approached the altar, a sudden gust of wind extinguished our lanterns, plunging the chamber into darkness. And then, from the shadows, a voice emerged, a low, guttural whisper that sent chills down my spine. You cannot break what was never meant to be broken. The chamber's oppressive silence pressed down on us as the guttural voice echoed through the darkness. Charles and I stood frozen, our lanterns extinguished by the sudden gust of wind. The faint glow of the symbols etched into the floor pulsed rhythmically, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. What was that? Charles whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't answer immediately, my mind racing to piece together everything we had uncovered. The curse, the bloodline, the sacrifices, it all led back to this altar, this place. Whatever force bound the Blackthorn family to its dark legacy was here, waiting. Stay close, I finally said, gripping his arm. We're not alone down here. We edged closer to the altar, each step deliberate and heavy. The raven figurine at its center seemed almost alive, its polished surface reflecting the faint glow of the symbols. As I reached out to touch it, the voice returned, louder and more menacing. You dare to defy what has been ordained? The ground beneath us trembled, and Charles staggered backward. This isn't right, he muttered. We shouldn't be here. We don't have a choice, I said firmly. If we leave now, the curse will destroy everything. This is our only chance to end it. Summoning every ounce of courage, I lifted the raven figurine. The air around us grew colder, and the pulsing symbols flared brighter. Beneath the figurine lay a small, weathered scroll. I unfurled it carefully, revealing a passage written in an ancient script. The words seemed to burn themselves into my mind as I read them aloud. To sever the bond and silence the restless, the blood of the chosen must be freely given. Through sacrifice, the curse shall be unbound. Charles's face drained of color. "No," he said, shaking his head. "You can't ask me to do this." "I'm not asking," I said, my voice heavy with regret. "But if we don't stop this now, more lives will be lost. The Blackthorn family's legacy has already caused enough suffering. There has to be another way," he pleaded. Aldridge said. Aldridge knew this was the only way, I interrupted. He just didn't have the courage to say it outright. The ground shook violently, and a deafening roar filled the chamber. Shadows coalesced into a humanoid figure, its eyes glowing with malevolent light. The curse itself had manifested, a grotesque and terrifying embodiment of the Blackthorn family's sins. "One must fall so others may rise," it intoned, its voice reverberating like thunder. Charles looked at me, desperation and fear etched across his face. "I can't do this," he whispered. "You can," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You have to. If not for yourself, then for your family, for everyone this curse has hurt." Tears welled in his eyes as he stepped toward the altar. The shadowy figure loomed closer, its presence growing more oppressive with each passing moment. Charles picked up the raven figurine and turned it over in his hands. His breath hitched as he placed it back on the altar and drew a small blade from the table. "I hope this works," he said, his voice barely audible. "It will," I assured him, though doubt gnawed at the edges of my mind. With a trembling hand, Charles pressed the blade against his palm, drawing a thin line of blood. As the crimson droplets hit the altar, the room erupted in a blinding light. The shadowy figure let out an ear-piercing shriek, its form dissolving into wisps of smoke that were pulled toward the altar and absorbed into the glowing symbols. The shaking subsided, and the chamber grew still. Charles collapsed to his knees, his breathing ragged. I rushed to his side, supporting him as the light from the symbols began to fade. "Is it over?" he asked weakly. I looked around, the oppressive atmosphere of the chamber noticeably lighter. "I think it is," I said. "You did it, Charles. You broke the curse." We emerged from the passageway into the cool night air, the manor looming behind us. The house felt different now, less foreboding, as though a great weight had been lifted. Lady Eleanor, though frail, seemed to have regained some color in her cheeks when we returned. Beatrice and Aldridge watched us with a mixture of relief and curiosity. "It's done," I announced. "The curse is broken." Lady Eleanor's lips quivered with the beginnings of a smile. "You saved us," she said softly. Charles, still pale and shaken, looked at her. "No, Aunt Eleanor. I saved us from ourselves." As dawn broke over Blackthorn Manor, I packed my belongings, ready to leave this chapter of my life behind. But as I stood at the gates, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house still held secrets, shadows lurking just out of sight. Charles joined me, his face a mixture of exhaustion and quiet determination. "Thank you, Harrow," he said, "for everything." I nodded. "Take care of yourself, Charles, and take care of this place. It deserves a fresh start." As I walked away, the morning sun bathed the manor in golden light, its ominous aura replaced by something almost peaceful. The curse was gone, but the memories of what had transpired here would linger, a reminder of the darkness that can take root when secrets are left to fester. For the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of closure. And yet, deep down, I knew this wouldn't be the last time I'd face the shadows of the past.